Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being truly well-informed. We take a stack of sources, find the essential insights, and unpack them for you.
And we're here to guide you through the material you've shared, helping you understand what's most important and, why it matters.
And today we are diving deep into the history of a fascinating place, Slovenia. Our source material gives us, well, an incredible journey through centuries, showing us how a distinct national identity was shaped under immense pressure and really diverse circumstances.
Yeah, the mission for this deep dive is to really get a handle on the forces, the empires, the cultural currents, the internal stuff that shaped the Slovenian people and nation, from the earliest human traces all the way to its place in modern Europe.
So we'll be exploring everything: ancient caves, Roman cities, early Slavic statehood, centuries under powerful empires, the really tumultuous 20th century, and finally, independence and European integration. Let's dig in. Okay, let's kick things off at the very, very start. Long before any maps looked like, modern Slovenia, the sources tell us about evidence of human presence. Gosh, stretching way back into the Pleistocene era.
Yeah, we're talking really ancient history here. Find some places like Villa Cappuccina near Truji.
Right.
And the material highlights some truly remarkable prehistoric discoveries. I mean, imagine finding an intact Homo sapien skeleton, maybe 25,000, even 35,000 years old.
Wow.
Buried with incredibly artistic grave goods. That points to a level of, early human culture we don't always expect,
Artistic grave goods from that long ago. That's absolutely fascinating. What else do they find? Any other standout things?
Well, the sources mention the Venus of Jurček statuette, dating back about 30,000 years BP. The material suggests this might be one of the oldest sort of plastic statues found in this territory. And there's also a unique child burial described found in Blagaj Cave. It included these little horse figurines made of bone.
Horse figurines, huh?
Yeah, these finds really paint a picture of early symbolic behavior, early life in the region.
It sounds like this area was significant even way back then. The sources point out its strategic importance, right? Because of its location on key land connections.
Exactly. Routes like the Alps Carnia, the Adriatic Vardar Valley, the Danubian Plain, it wasn't some remote corner.
They even mention specific trade routes.
Yeah, for things like marble, salt, iron ores, gold passing through. It was connected.
Okay, so fast forward quite a bit. The Celts arrive.
Right. The Celts were living there before the Romans showed up. And what's interesting is the sources suggest the Celts are the ones who actually gave the country its name. They set up settlements, towns like Mohoriev and Emona.
Emona, that rings the bell. That becomes modern Ljubljana, doesn't it?
Precisely. And then fast forward again to the 6th century, the ancestors of present-day Slovenes arrived.
The Southern Slavs.
Southern Slavs, yeah. They settled in the Eastern Alps, the Pannonian Plain, areas we now know as Carniola, Carinthia, Styria, Prekmurj.
And this is where we see the emergence of, what do the sources call it? The first Slavic state in the area.
That's Karantanija. Yeah, the material describes it as the first medieval Slavic state. Existing roughly from the 6th to the 12th century.
Okay.
It had a structure, typical European organization for the time, was independent for about 200 years.
200 years, what?
And at its peak, its territory was quite a bit larger than modern Slovenia. So it represents a really important early marker of a distinct political entity there.
Okay, so from these early Slavic settlements in Karantanija, the sources really highlight the Roman era as the next sort of major turning point.
Absolutely. The Roman period is presented as transformative, particularly for urban development.
Right.
The Romans were, master builders, administrators. They established towns based on Roman law. These quickly became centers for finance, politics, justice. Many got that high status of Roman colonies.
And Emona, near today's Ljubljana, that's the prime example of this.
It is. Emona was founded as a Roman town, initially planned like a military camp around 14 AD.
A military camp first.
Yeah, the sources explain it was because of its crucial strategic location. Connecting the Mediterranean to the Pannonian Plain, controlling the lower Sava River basin, vital for trade, vital for defense.
Makes sense.
And the camp itself was pretty substantial, planned for about 6,000 soldiers, solid walls, a watchtower.
So it started as a fort, really.
Exactly. But then, after the military presence kind of shifted, the town of Emona fully developed on a safer terrace nearby.
Okay.
Its construction was largely finished by the second half of the 1st century AD under Emperor Vespasian, making it the first real, full-fledged Roman town in this territory.
And that status brought advantages, I assume.
Oh, definitely. Municipal self-government, its own council, the benefits of Roman law, Roman administration. It was a big deal.
And the Roman impact wasn't just political or military, was it? The sources talk about huge cultural changes, infrastructure.
Totally. They built roads, water systems, aqueducts, advanced sanitation, really connecting this region to the great world of Rome.
That's incredible infrastructure for the time.
It is. And the archaeology is fascinating. Like that detail about a dry toilet with a balcony view, apparently quite rare across the empire.
A toilet with a view.
Right. But beyond the physical stuff, the introduction of Latin in administration, that started a slow shift away from local languages. It contributed to the gradual assimilation of the local Celtic population.
So people started speaking Latin?
Well, the elite certainly became bilingual, knowing Latin and Greek. It was the language of power and administration.
And Amono wasn't the only Roman site.
No. The sources mention other important Roman sites in the Sochi and Drava river valleys and a significant town at Salea. And Amona's legacy, I mean, it's clearly still relevant. It was part of the European Capital of Culture program back in 2010.
Right. Still resonates.
Its historical significance is undeniable. And the sources present the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, end of the 5th century AD, as this major dividing line.
Marking the shift to a Christian era.
Exactly. Transitioning from largely pre-Christian to Christian. This period also saw assimilation continue, but maybe more through bilingualism and the gradual acceptance of Christianity spreading up from the south.
Okay, so the Roman Empire fades, and the Slavs who'd arrived earlier become the dominant group, which brings us back to Karantanija in the medieval period.
Yes, Karantanija gets highlighted again as that first medieval Slavic state. The material describes its economy, agriculture, mining, metallurgy, trade, and notes its typical European political organization.
And it seems like it was trying to, build its influence, make connections.
Definitely. Through diplomacy, strategic marriages, particularly with the Bavarian aristocracy, according to the sources.
But that independence didn't last forever.
No, relatively short-lived in the grand scheme. Mid-8th century, Karantanija fell under Franconian domination. It lost its statehood, its independence, but, and this is important, the sources say it continued to exist as an administrative unit within the larger Franconian Empire for quite some time.
Ah, okay, so not totally wiped off the map.
Not entirely. And this is when Christianity, the Western form, becomes more deeply rooted.
Introduced by the Franks.
Well, spread significantly by Franconian bishops, yeah. They also brought the Latin alphabet. This era also saw feudalism get firmly established.
And the sources say this happened relatively early here.
Yeah, compared to neighbors like Italy or Hungary, firmly in place by the 11th century.
How did this affect the relationship between the Slavic population, the Slovenes, and the new lords? Mostly German, right?
Right. The material describes a pretty clear dynamic. German nobility settled the fertile lands, the best spots, while the Slovenes, who were shifting from semi-nomadic life to settled farming, were often in the mountainous, forested areas. And they increasingly became tenants of these German lords.
But the sources make it clear this wasn't just passive acceptance, they pushed back.
No, and this is where that theme of identity and resilience really starts coming through in the material. Despite becoming tenants, losing their state, the sources emphasize that Slovenes actively insisted on keeping some self-administration, some special rights.
Like what kind of rights?
They secured privileges. They even got early written privileges in German as early as the 12th century, defending things like the right to a free parish.
So even without a state, they found ways to preserve some autonomy. That's interesting.
Precisely. But the pressure was constant. There was a big threat of Germanization from the lords, from schools teaching in German, from German Catholic bishops.
Right.
But what the sources consistently highlight again and again is the crucial role the Slovenes themselves played in preserving their language, literary and spoken. That, plus maintaining their religious and ethnic community, became the absolute core of their identity when they didn't have political independence.
And this long period of foreign domination, first Franconian, then overwhelmingly Austrian under the Habsburgs, that really shapes the next few centuries, 6 centuries under the Habsburgs. I mean, that's just an immense period of history. How did Slovenian identity evolve during that time within that huge empire?
Well, the sources are pretty clear. Slovenian identity really took shape under the complex pressures, political, economic, intellectual, of Western European civilization, but specifically within that Habsburg structure.
And their location mattered too, right? Kind of at a crossroads.
Yeah, being situated right there at the confluence of Central Europe, the Balkans, and the Italian plain, that also fostered a growing awareness of being distinct,
Were there specific moments that really accelerated this awareness? Big events?
Yes, the material points to turning points, like Napoleon's brief Illyrian provinces 1809 to 1813,
Ah, yes, and Napoleon.
and the big revolutionary waves of 1848, the Spring of Nations. These events definitely impacted the sense of identity. But the search for this modern identity, it really started gaining steam in the second half of the 18th century.
Okay.
It's interesting, the sources note that even as late as the 1780s, Slovenes were often still seen primarily as a special Slavic nation, and frequently identified by names like Karantanijans, linking them right back to that first state.
So the name Slovenian as a political identity that came later?
Not immediately, no, not in a widespread political sense. The sources mention the name Slovenian or Slovenes, popping up in writings earlier, but it really gained political traction through literature and the growing struggles for national recognition, for minority rights, that really defined the later 19th century within the empire.
And language. The sources seem to put language absolutely front and center here.
Critically central. Yeah, the material we reviewed just stresses this over and over. Despite centuries of foreign rule Franconian, then the long Habsburg era and active attempts at Germanization,
Yeah.
and even formal decrees like an 1871 ordinance banning public use of Slovenian
They actually banned it.
in public contexts, yeah. But despite all that, the Slovenes managed to recover and maintain their national consciousness, primarily by preserving their language. The Catholic Church is often mentioned as playing a protective role here, and figures like the language reformer Jurnej Krajkar back in the early 19th century were already voicing concerns about, the potential destruction of their language and identity under foreign rule.
So without a state, language basically became the carrier of national identity?
Absolutely. The full modern Slovenian national awareness really consolidated throughout the 19th century within that Habsburg political environment. This period saw significant cultural developments, like founding the Slovenian National Theater in Ljubljana,
Right.
but Germanization attempts continued. That 1840 decree made German the official language in most communes. And even something seemingly small, like banning folk music at public events, could trigger real indignation and protest. It shows how deeply language and culture were tied to identity.
That's powerful. Even folk music becomes a point of resistance.
It really highlights the struggle. The sources note that, public music life before WWI often relied on foreign music, foreign performers, because major Slovenian composers were maybe lacking. But crucially, folk music, choral societies, piano studios, those flourished.
Okay.
The challenge, according to the material, was really institutionalizing Slovenian music, and that faced disruptions, described rather vaguely in the sources as the personal elimination of the most able ones during unstable times.
Sounds ominous. So a vibrant cultural base, but facing systemic barriers. And during this time, the idea of uniting South Slavs, the Yugoslav idea, that starts to gain traction too.
Yes, the sources indicate this idea was present initially in the programs of all Slovenian parties, seen as a potential path forward, maybe a confederation of Slavic nations.
But not everyone was convinced.
Well, trust in the idea got shaken after events like the German nationalist terror around 1901 and the Russian defeat in 1905. The material describes a divide appearing. Some Slovenes still saw a future within the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, pushing for reforms,
Okay.
while others increasingly looked towards full independence and the Yugoslav idea, especially influenced by President Wilson's ideas about national self-determination as World War I was ending.
Right, that takes us into the 20th century and the huge upheaval of World War I. What was the direct impact on Slovenia itself?
WWI hit hard. The sources describe Slovenia becoming part of the front line, specifically the Italian front. Thousands of Slovenes were mobilized into the Austro-Hungarian army.
A tough position to be in.
Definitely. But even within the army, that process of identity, of nation building, it continued. The material notes the first Slovenian newspapers were actually published right there in the army.
Wow, really? Even under those conditions? And the end of the war, of course, meant the end of the Habsburg Empire, after centuries.
Exactly. The dissolution of Austria-Hungary led to a really rapid series of events. November 1st, 1918, the state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs was proclaimed,
Okay.
which then quickly unified with the Kingdom of Serbia in December 1918 to form the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, SCS.
Was this seen as like the fulfillment of that Yugoslav idea for Slovenes finally getting together?
Well, there was certainly initial hope for independence, for some kind of national unification with other South Slavs. But the sources highlight that challenges popped up almost immediately.
Like what?
There was this fundamental misunderstanding, or maybe a deliberate framing, that the SCS peoples were basically a single entity, not distinct nations. And the debate between creating a unitary state versus a federal one,
Right.
the unitary side won out.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. The material describes Slovenia essentially being expected to just fit in as like a third nation tribe within this new structure.
That must have caused some serious disappointment. Hopes dashed.
It did. The sources detail growing discontent all through the interwar period under the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. There was a negative reaction against symbols of their Austrian past, and the new national symbols largely represented the Serbian community.
And language. That was always key.
Crucially, the constitutional protection for the Slovene language was abolished, and demands for a regional division that would allow for a Slovene parliament denied.
So it sounds like their hopes for autonomy were actually being curtailed within the new Yugoslav state?
They were. The state became increasingly centralized, authoritarian. In 1930, a royal dictatorship was proclaimed. It explicitly forbade discussion of national divisions and led to repression against Slovenian political activity.
Wow.
The sources note this centralizing pressure eased slightly just before WWII, March 1939, when a federal state of Slovenia was sort of theoretically formed within the collapsing Yugoslavia.
But then came the invasion, World War II.
Yeah. April 1941, Yugoslavia was invaded, broken apart. Slovenia itself was divided up, occupied by Germany, Italy, and Hungary. Ljubljana, the capital, got incorporated into German territory, becoming what the sources call an alien city.
A grim time.
Absolutely. The occupiers suppressed any independence aspirations, naturally. But the material also points out that strong national forces within Slovenia actively worked to prevent the cultural and economic dominance the occupiers tried to impose.
Resistance continued.
Yes. They also mention, interestingly, that a historical religious division, Catholic versus more Protestant areas, was seen by some as a hindrance to a fully unified national resistance or renaissance during that period.
Okay, so with the occupation, a resistance movement starts to organize.
Yes. The initial reaction from the existing leadership, the sources describe it as somewhat ineffective. But within about a month of the invasion, an anti-occupational underground organization was formed, the Coalition of Anti-Fascist Organizations of Slovene Lands.
Right. What were their main goals during that incredibly difficult time?
Their program, as outlined in the sources, had pretty broad aims: peace, national unity across all Slovenian territory, democratization, industrialization after the war, and cultural autonomy.
Ambitious goals under occupation.
Very. This organization was active throughout the occupation until 1944, operating under constant threat, facing German investigations, repression, a very dangerous existence.
And after the war ended in 1945, Slovenia became a republic within the new Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia.
That's right, following the victory of the partisan movement. And the sources really highlight this period as one of rapid modernization for Slovenia, significant growth in living standards, industrialization. It led to Slovenia becoming the most economically developed republic within Yugoslavia.
How did the economy actually function under socialism there? What did the sources say?
Well, the material describes a system where key sectors, banking, transport, heavy industry, were under what they called social ownership. But uniquely for a socialist state, private entrepreneurs were allowed in areas like commerce, certain services.
Oh, interesting. Not totally state-controlled then.
Not entirely. A distinct Slovenian economy was consciously built within the Yugoslav framework of social self-management. The sources emphasize this as a system where workers and enterprises had a significant say in management, in decisions, aiming for rapid change and self-development.
That sounds quite different from, say, the Soviet model.
It had unique features, yeah.
Yeah.
The sources describe hints of market and citizen engagement, and they mention cultural avant-gardes flourishing in this environment.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing.
No. The material also notes that later in the period, the Yugoslav model faced significant socioeconomic stagnation and really uneven development across the different republics, even with Slovenia's comparative success.
And cultural life under socialism, how did that fare?
Key cultural institutions, the university, national library, theater, orchestra, they were established or strengthened. New facilities were built. Architects like George Plečnik made lasting contributions.
Plečnik, right. His work is amazing.
It is. And the sources reiterate that struggle for the Slovenian language continued, even under socialism. Despite periods of pressure or prohibitions, they note that priests played a vital role in publishing Slovenian books, keeping the language alive in print.
It really is striking how that thread of language preservation just runs through everything, century after century.
It's a consistent theme, absolutely highlighted in the sources. However, the later socialist period also saw public expressions of discontent against the central government. Starting in the late 60s, early 70s,
Like protests.
events like February 66, challenges to the idea of the Republic of Slovenia's sovereignty, things like that are mentioned. While the sources note these were generally milder forms of protest compared to what happened in, say, Croatia,
Okay.
they still led to the removal of key activists from positions of influence.
This sounds like it's building towards the late 1980s, the Slovene Spring.
Exactly. Triggered by the economic crisis gripping Yugoslavia, the Slovene Spring in '88 was a distinct democratic movement. The sources describe it as largely using peaceful methods, newspapers, manifestos, large public demonstrations,
What were they advocating for?
political reform, democratization within Yugoslavia, and increasingly outright independence. Culture was deeply involved, too. The material mentions musician Zoran Predin, even techno music being associated with themes of freedom then.
Techno for freedom, but peaceful didn't mean there wasn't repression, right?
Oh, no. The sources note attempts by authorities to restrict free expression, a law targeting media freedom, police actions against emerging civil movements like those focused on anti-racism, anti-fascism, reports of sympathizers facing abuse, even incarceration.
So a real struggle. This period of activism, this ferment, it paved the way for the move towards independence.
It absolutely did. Slovenia held its first free, multi-party elections in 1990. That saw the rise of the democratic opposition. And this new political landscape allowed Slovenia to start actively preparing for liberalization, for independence, drafting a new constitution, privatization laws, getting ready.
And this preparation culminates in the Declaration of Independence and that brief but significant 10-day war.
Exactly. June 26, 1991, Slovenia declared independence. The sources state this action, plus Slovenia's military preparations, particularly its well-organized territorial defense force, directly led to the 10-day war, triggered partly by incidents in neighboring Croatia and the Federal Yugoslav Army's reaction.
So after all those centuries, Slovenia is finally an independent state. What were the immediate challenges they faced, according to the sources?
Well, the material outlines several pretty significant challenges right off the bat. Unresolved border issues with Hungary, with Austria. Financially, the new state faced difficulties. It struggled initially to fully control its own borders, and it inherited what the sources call legacy burdens, past treaties, financial obligations.
Like old debts?
Yeah, things like that. They even reference a historic case about access to the sea at the International Court of Justice that Slovenia lost way back in 1787.
1787. Wow, that's a long memory in international law.
It certainly is. Just a reminder of how deep historical issues can run. Anyway, the formal establishment of the independent state was solidified with the new constitution in December '91. And the sources really emphasized the crucial need at this point to build, to justify, a new distinct sovereign identity after all those centuries of foreign rule.
Slovenia was often seen internationally as maybe the most successful of the former Yugoslav republics in its transition, wasn't it?
Yes, the material notes Slovenia was relatively ethnically homogeneous compared to others, and it had a comparatively higher level of economic and social development inherited from the Yugoslav period. Its post-socialist transition was often described internationally as successful, even labeled the most successful ex-communist state in some analyses.
But the sources also mention some criticisms of this transition. It wasn't perfect.
They do. Criticisms highlighted include the privatization process described as relatively gradual, slower, maybe less democratic compared to some others, issues with deregulation, and the perception in some analyses that, rather than a true change of guard, previous elites were simply replaced by new ones.
Right, the new elite problem. And after independence came the big push for integration into Europe.
Major strategic goal, yeah. Slovenia joined NATO and the EU in 2004, and notably was the first new member state to adopt the euro currency back in 2007.
What did the sources say about the economic impact of joining the EU and the Eurozone? Was it all positive?
Well, the initial period was perceived positively. Analyses showed higher credit ratings, but the material indicates this was followed by significant economic pressures.
Like what?
Surging prices. Real estate became very expensive. Growth saw a sharp fall. Slovenia's credit rating was eventually lost, and the country faced a debt crisis.
The debt crisis.
Yeah. The sources describe this challenging period as mirroring aspects of Greece's financial difficulties. It led to what they termed a confidence crisis in the economy.
So joining wasn't just an automatic economic win, it brought new vulnerabilities.
That's what the material suggests. The sources caution that just focusing on comparative success against other post-socialist states Well, it risks overlooking a deeper analysis of long-term economic patterns, historical regional differences in income.
For instance.
They point out, for example, that some regions, like the littoral, actually had very high incomes even before WWI, when they were part of the Habsburg Empire. It shows a long history of economic variation that didn't just start after socialism.
That's a really important perspective. And what are the key challenges modern Slovenia still faces today, according to the material?
The sources mention the ongoing need to consolidate public finances and managing the societal and economic impacts of an aging population as significant current issues.
Okay, looking back over this incredible sweep of history, how do our sources kind of bring together the key influences that really forged Slovenian identity? What are the main ingredients?
They repeatedly emphasize a blend of influences. First, the Slavic origins, right back to the Karantanijans, that early idea of a special Slavic nation. Then, a strong, persistent Western orientation shaped by Christianity, centuries under Roman, Franconian, and especially Habsburg rule.
Right.
And finally, the idea of Euro-Slavic cooperation, though that Western influence is particularly highlighted in preserving their unique identity.
And it seems the 19th century, that age of national movements, was just a critical time for solidifying this.
Absolutely. That's when demands for language recognition, establishing a Slovenian university, unifying Slovenian-speaking territories.
Yeah.
All that gained real political momentum within the empire.
And underpinning all of it, always, is the enduring power of language and culture.
It's the central thread the sources trace. Absolutely. From maybe early efforts influenced by figures like Saint Cyril and Methodius standardizing Slavic languages, through the Catholic Church's protective role, to the constant struggle against prohibitions like that 1871 decree we mentioned.
Yeah.
Language was consistently the key element. Literature, music, architecture, other cultural expressions, they were vital tools for forming, for preserving national awareness across centuries when statehood just wasn't there. The material points to these as the bedrock of their identity, even when facing suppression.
The sources even touch on how identity is perceived in more recent times,
Yeah.
like today.
Yeah, noting that in the postmodern era, with increased integration, diversity, questions of identity can feel less about sticking to single cultural patterns and maybe more like a complex, maybe even fragmented application form, or a kind of polyphony of different narratives about who you are.
That's an interesting way to put it. But despite those modern complexities, the historical contributions, language development, literature, music, architecture, they're clearly highlighted as part of that resilient, enduring cultural identity forged over millennia. So that's the journey the sources take us on. From ancient cave dwellers adapting to the landscape, the emergence of early Slavic states, navigating the power of Rome, the long centuries under vast empires like the Habsburgs, enduring division, occupation, and the world wars, building a unique model of socialism within Yugoslavia, and finally, achieving independence and integrating into the EU. It's quite a story.
What seems undeniably clear from the material we reviewed is that Slovenian identity wasn't built on a continuous history of statehood that was absent for centuries. Instead, it was preserved, it was nurtured, and ultimately defined by cultural resilience. And the conservation, the development of the Slovenian language, that stands out as the single most critical factor, often defended under just intense external pressure.
So why does this history matter to you listening right now? Well, understanding this deep dive shows the incredible, almost improbable resilience needed to keep a distinct national identity in a world often dominated by larger powers. It illustrates the long-term consequences of seemingly distant historical events and how they continue to shape a nation's path, even today.
Yeah, that narrative of preserving a unique cultural, linguistic identity against such sustained foreign domination, it's powerful. It really speaks to the deep roots of this nation.
And here is something for you to consider, building on everything we've discussed. Given Slovenia's deep-seated historical resilience, fundamentally rooted in preserving its unique culture and language across centuries without its own state, how might this inherited trait, this deep cultural muscle memory, shape its ability to navigate the economic volatility and demographic shifts it faces today, now as a fully integrated European nation? What can this specific history of cultural preservation teach us, maybe about the enduring power of identity and language when faced with globalizing forces and very modern challenges? Something to think about.